welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I'm here with a fantastic author of a book that came out a little while ago, but is going to be revisiting the market in paperback form. I really love this book, and I am so excited to talk about it. So let's get right into it. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, my name is Carolyn Hays, and I'm the author of Letter to My Transgender Daughter.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this really beautiful book with me. I spent a lot longer with it than I really thought I was going to, because I just found myself thinking about so much and seeking out other texts and really doing a lot of interesting work around it. Before we get into the book itself, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your journey to the book, your other writing experience, and how you came to this project.
Well, I'm writing under a pen name, so Carolyn Hays is not my actual name. But I've written a lot of books. I've published a lot of novels, and I've published with, I've had a New York Times Notable Books of the Year, and I've published with Simon & Schuster and Hachette and lots of, Random House, you name it. And then lots of overseas publishing houses as well. And so, this is my first nonfiction work, although I've also had, essays and op-eds in the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR and things like that. So I'm a little incognito.
That's super interesting. And I wondered right off the bat, one of the things I love about it, among many, is the structure. It really, it all sort of pivots on this moment of a particular knock at the door, which we can talk about. And I'm wondering, did you find that one, did writing nonfiction in long form present new challenges for you? And two, did you find yourself drawing on the skills of a novelist to write it?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. The novelist skills came in. Yeah. And the fact that I've worked in large scale, a lot of times it's just when you first start writing, it's very hard to hold something that large architecturally in your brain, book length. And so I have a lot of, I had a lot of experience doing that and being able to see something structurally that, that's, 200, 300 pages, even more, I've done that. So it was very helpful. Yeah. And I like going into scene. I think it's important to show people what it felt like by being really embedded in those moments. And so a lot of that is the work of a novelist.
The book is very engaging in an emotional way, and I think it engenders a lot of empathy in the reader, which is clearly one of its aims, which is fantastic. And so I'm wondering, one of the messages that you talk about is how, as a parent, and maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse a little bit, but one of your messages is about loving better. When you discover that one of your children is queer or is dealing with a trans identity that is, something that they're revealing to you for the first time. And I'm wondering, that idea of loving better, how does it drive the book, and sort of how does it drive both what you're doing for your daughter with the book and what you are doing for perhaps the parents of other transgender children? I know that's a huge question, and I apologize, but
no, it's actually broader than that, because it's not just it's all children. I mean, we need to do a better job, with all of our kids. I mean, it's not just that. I mean, you could, have a father. I mean, Jeff in the book, my husband, he was a Division I, athlete, and then played, kind of pro soccer before the MLS. And so, his identity was so wrapped up in that. And so many sports dads, kind of shove their identity of sports down into their children. So many times we confuse, and we're having children to right wrongs or to be an extension of ourselves in the world. And we really confuse our identity and their identity. And sometimes really lovingly, we want them to have a better life than we had. We don't want them to make the same mistakes that we made, but there's so much denying the fact that this is an individual human being who is going to make their way in the world and is not you, is not a reflection of your hopes and dreams. They have their own hopes and dreams. And so it's particularly true, of course, when you have if you're a straight parent, cisgender, not trans at all, and you suddenly have a child who is changing, gender identity. Well, their gender identity was always clear. They're changing for the outside world. Those parents really struggle because, especially if they haven't, kind of, if they're blurring those identities, and it's really hard for them in that they've created a whole future narrative for their child that they're really invested in. That's very imaginary. We all do it. We want to see our children happy in the future. But when a kid changes and goes through transition, for some parents, all of that goes away, and then they have nothing, no future. They can't see it. And that's compounded by the fact that they also possibly don't know that there are lots of trans people doing, dentists and, judges and, in the military and plumbers and whatever, they're living their lives. And so they don't know that because, there are so few trans people, statistically speaking. So but that holds true for all parents. All parents really have to go through that process where they let the child be themselves in all the different shapes that can take, in all the different ways that happens.
Yeah, it seems like it frames parenting in a sort of collaborative way rather than a hierarchical process. Is that something that, like, to you is kind of part of it?
Yeah, well, good luck with hierarchical, good luck. I mean, God bless, Godspeed, if that's your thing. All parenting is humbling. It should be humbling. It is a huge job. And if you think you've got it all right, which we kind of thought we did, we were kind of cocky parents. If you think you've got it all down to, and you're raising this child, and then you've got a system, and you're raising the next child exactly the same because you've got a system, you got a third child, and you're raising that kid exactly the same because you got a system, you're not parenting individuals. Like, you are someone running a system, and it just breaks down. So we really have to see each child as a human being. We have to see each human being and, an adult as a human being, each on their own path. But it should be humbling. Parenting has been humbling for me from the very start, and I think that's just doing it right.
Yeah, it sounds very humbling and also very vulnerable, and it feels like a lot of vulnerability went into the writing of this book because, you do examine your own parenting skills and you look at choices that you made and you evaluate them again, like with your new knowledge and your new experience. And so could you talk about like what that kind of vulnerability entails, like for a writer and for a parent, and maybe also like about like privilege, because I think you get really vulnerable about exploring privilege too, and relative access to things. And could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I'd like to just talk about cowardice first. So, in kind of talking about the book, very early on in the first pages of the book, you find out that we've had a child who has recently transitioned from, the child was assigned male at birth, but made it very clear that she was a girl, that we were getting it wrong, that God got it wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And then as we were kind of grappling with that and trying to figure that out, which was not simple, we did eventually, allow our now daughter to, wear the clothes she wanted to, put a barrette in her hair. We started using female pronouns and letting people know. Shortly thereafter, we got a knock at the door from the Department of Children and Families. Someone had made an anonymous call accusing us of child abuse for supporting our child. And so that, of course, wrecked our lives in many ways. It's not a tragedy. It built resilience. We came together as a family and we rallied, but it certainly did absolutely change us fundamentally. And eventually, a year later, after that knock at the door and all of the kind of chaos that ensued, we did leave. We moved.
Mm.
And so in the book, I talk about that move and how, I don't know how my daughter will one day see that into her 20s, into her 30s, whether that was, I think it was the right move. I don't know the other move. Can't see that trajectory, but I do know that when I am hearing, families now, because what happened to us, became law in the state of Texas, for example. The governor there a couple of years ago said any parent who is supporting their child who is transgender should be, reported and investigated for child abuse. So I have seen families who've stayed. I've seen families who had no choice because we have a ton of privilege getting to that. We had the privilege to go. We had the money to go. We figured out our jobs and recoordinated. We were able to leave. And so there, when I look at the bravery of the people who are staying in these red states, where there have been over 500 anti-trans laws introduced in the last year alone, throughout the country that are anti-trans. There's just such incredible beauty and bravery in staying. And so, I have to think about my own cowardice there, should we have stood our ground and said, no, this is our place. We have a right to this place. We talk about the United States of America, but, for our family, we talk about the 18 states of America, because as my daughter looks at colleges, she's looking at about 18 states, and Canada, as places where she will be protected under law. Yes. So cowardice is something that I do talk about a little bit in the book, but has really hit me more and more as I see other families navigating all of this.
That speaks to another thing that I think the book does really well, which is providing a lot of context of various kinds, like for what your family experienced. You go into the historical context of LGBT history and what sort of led to the present moment in those terms. But also the political context of, as you have just said, the increasing discrimination and the decreasing legal protection. So I'm wondering what kind of research you did in both of these avenues, and sort of like if that process of research sort of changed your own perspective on your daughter and on your own role as a mother.
Yeah, well, one of the things is that, in so many ways, this is not my story to tell. It's my daughter's story to tell. And so really had to go back in there and just kind of be a witness. And so it is one of the first books. I don't know of any other books where, there was somebody kind of journalistically taking notes throughout the child's, the trans child's childhood, to really say, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm seeing. So I was really like, bearing witness. So that was the first bit of research, was personal. The second, is kind of the historical stuff. Was just incredible to see, historians and anthropologists and all these different archaeologists, all these different people finding proof of trans people throughout history and throughout cultures. And so that was, really groundbreaking for me, to learn this incredibly rich history. And then the current, stuff, it's a barrage just to keep up, especially during legislative session, what is going on. And that's terrifying. It's terrifying that in Florida right now on a campus at a state institution, a student who's trans could use the bathroom, and if they don't leave when somebody screams at them, they can be arrested. Just for being in that space. So yeah, there's incredibly terrifying things out there that are going on right now. Yeah, and then also just to going kind of back to privilege again, but like, I didn't realize how much I thought that the universe and I had this agreement, like, I'm going to be the best mother I can, and we're good, universe. Like, you're going to be okay with that. You're going to help me out here. And there's a lot in the book about faith and God, because I'm also a person of faith. But how quickly I realized that I was living a very white, privileged American existence, and I have trans people. My family in particular has so much to owe. African Americans, civil rights history, the current struggles that facing the Black community. I mean, the amount of work and the parallels there are incredible. And so I'm just thankful that, they fought so many battles, because their playbook is, just an incredible resource. And it's also the way forward. We have to build coalitions with each other. And then I got to do, to see what LGBTQ folks have done, and what the elders in this community, what they fought for. It was really such a privilege to do that work. And Jean Manford in particular, who was the founder of PFLAG, her story, Jean Montfort, sorry, she was fantastic, and her son Morty. So it was really, it was a joy to, be able to find ways structurally to put all of that history in there, not all of it, but to be able to put some of that history in.
There's also a ton of research on gender from a number of angles. And as somebody, as a brief aside, before I fell into libraries, I got a PhD in gender history, and I worked on medieval notions of gender and stuff like that. And the process of exploring gender theory from all of these disciplinary viewpoints, I found to be like transformative, not just for like my research and my career as a historian, but for my sense of myself, and how I saw my place in the world and the world around me. So I'm wondering if there's anything about your own research process that sort of like reframed things for you or about the world. Did you find yourself transformed at all by what you experienced and explored?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's the irony, is that my daughter supposedly went through a transition, but she knew who she was all along. So it really wasn't much of a transition. The rest of us had the doors of our hearts blown wide open, and got to experience all this different level of empathy that we just were blind to. We got to see how gender is everywhere all the time in ways that we were blind to. Yeah, and then the personal stuff. I mean, of course, like it's so important for me, especially as a young woman, to understand like that, gender is a social construct, right? That was just so liberating for me. And just to know that I'd been put in a box, and I'd been, kept in that box, and that so much of the world around me was dedicated to me staying in that box. And, that, and then just knowing the box existed, was incredibly freeing and liberating. But of course, when it comes to my daughter, that doesn't really help all that much, because gender is also something that is very clearly, it's almost one of our senses. I make the argument that it is a sense, like, because, we used to think that there was the senses, taste, touch, smell, da da da. We now know that there are many more senses, like equilibrium, knowing how close someone is, knowing where my arms and legs are in space and time, like there are a lot of, knowing that I have to pee is actually one of our senses. But I kind of make the argument that knowing our gender is a sense, it's something so core and deeply held in our bodies, and in the map of our bodies, the neurological map of our bodies. I think that I learned a lot, about gender as something much deeper, and as a person of faith, like on the soul level. And then I also, kind of lightened up about, I think we all have as a culture, and I think that's why Barbie is making sense to us coming out this year, where it might not have made as much sense to us coming out even just 5 years ago. But that we, that there's feminism is a big, huge umbrella, and we can fit a lot of people under it. The work, Roxane Gay's work in Bad Feminist, and things like that, really helped me, because I think I had, a form of sexism embedded in my feminism that felt like anybody who, wore big pink high heels, was not for the cause. So I think that's some of the work that I've done in this book, but also just culturally, kind of some of the conversations we're having around the biggest, broadest definitions of feminism, and that we can, join together.
I love that idea of gender as a sense, because I feel like it includes both sort of the sense of gender as something that is sort of instinctive or natural, but also that it's something that can be cultivated and understood in different ways, and refined, and like it sort of like contains the paradoxes, sort of that we're kind of talking about.
Yeah. Good. And I'm glad I'm talking to a historian that the book held up okay. Now I'm nervous. I'm like, oh my gosh, an actual historian read my book.
No, it's theoretically sound. I love
Good.
it's a little bit of time since the book first came out. We're looking at the paperback release now. And in that time, have you had any new insights or new perspectives that make you view the book in a new way?
I mean, it just becomes more and more urgent. I just wish it hadn't, I mean, I really wish this book had become, what a weird and wacky thing to have happened to a family way back. Like that makes no sense. We just kept making progress and making progress and making progress. And instead, we made some progress, and then there was this enormous backlash. I think one of the things that's really important for me in looking at the backlash, which is, a lot of Republican politicians making it part of their platform to be proudly anti-transgender and anti-civil rights for trans people, as well as, far right podcasters and, people who are, influencers and what have you, to gain followers, to get votes, to get money, to create fear, and to pretend and drum up, here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem, panic, 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 and I'm the only person who can fix it. And even these, kind of like thirsty comedians who want to punch down on trans people because they think they're being countercultural, when you're like, dudes, are you kidding me? You're being so in line with our culture. I wish that the book was a little footnote, like to access a place in time in history where things were still not quite on the rails. But instead, I think, it's become, more urgent, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And lastly, one more question, because and this might seem like an obvious one off the bat, but obviously the title of the book is Letters to My Transgender Daughter, and the book is written in the second person. So you are literally writing directly to her. And I wondered also if that is perhaps like a technique encouraging empathy for the in the reader, if that makes sense, like, because I felt like I was being addressed myself, in addition to your daughter, and in a an interesting way that really did sort of directly and explicitly, literally invite me to step into her shoes in a strange way. Like, was that something that you thought about too?
Well, as soon as I figured it out, and a lot of it is like, Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and looking at that structure, it just fixed a lot of problems on the pronoun level. Because I could not write a book in which I was going to misgender my kid up until the whole backstory, until she changes to the pronouns that she identifies with. There's just no way. And then also, every time I use it, it's so loud, it's so heavy, it's so, we imagine, you say he and little boy, and we imagine a he and a little boy. And then I would have to flip everybody on that. And I was like, that's just such a heavy lift. I don't feel comfortable with it all the way through. I want to get it right. So the direct address of you allowed me to move to a non-gendered pronoun for all of it, which was, I think, very important for the reader, because they couldn't gender the child constantly. They had to keep an open mind on you, just as you have to keep an open mind on they, Yes. So that was huge. When I figured that out, I was like, oh, thank God. Also, Between the World and Me is just a gorgeous, gorgeous book and doing incredibly important work. So, and then there's others, Letters to a Young Writer and other ones that use the direct address as well. But that was one thing. And then this other thing kind of snuck in, which is what you're talking about. And in particular, I've been moved by the responses from, adults who are trans and how they've talked about their experience of the direct address, and that it felt like, what I hope it feels like. And again, like I didn't quite know this, but that once I say you, like, are deserving of love, the passages about love and about, dignity and honor and respect, and that you is this strange door, and it swings wide open between us. And so it is no longer my daughter receiving it, really becomes the you who are possibly receiving that. And for so many, adult trans people, they didn't get that from their families necessarily, that unconditional love. And so that I hope that, and I've gotten some really moving responses to the book in that way, as well as kind of gratitude for being able to look at a little kid, like a little kid going through their own trans story, and that witness part of it, I think, was also helpful. Yeah, so you're right. Pronouns are powerful. And so I was very lucky to find that entry point.
Oh, well, that's a really lovely thought. And this has been a really lovely conversation. And, thank you so much for stopping by the show to talk about this lovely book. I'm really excited to share the new edition with our patrons. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate
No
it.
problem. You're very welcome. All right, listeners, please check out A Girlhood, Letters to My Transgender Daughter. I think you'll really appreciate it, and you will learn something and feel something, which is, all that we can ask books to do. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.